Apple is basically screwed without China. They were a once-in-a-century partner. So many marriages are broken up that the engineers are given the divorce avoidance program, these different policies to save their marriages. Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs made Apple products unique. Terry Guo and Tim Cook made them ubiquitous.
Apple in China, Patrick McGee. You've probably already read this book at this point, but we're going to give it the China Talk gloss. Co-hosting today, Kyle Chan, who's finishing up his postdoc at Princeton. I thought this book was fascinating. I thought I knew all there was to know about Apple in China. Boy, was I wrong, especially this sort of deep history of how Apple got in the country and scaled in the first place was the part that really caught my eye. So we're going to start there and then bring it through to contemporary industrial policy and the dilemmas facing the company and the country today. Patrick, Kyle, welcome to China Talk.
Great, thank you.
Great to be here.
I think I want to start with the near bankruptcy moment and the challenges of manufacturing in America in the 1990s. So as you write, Patrick, there is very much a like real men own fabs energy to hardware manufacturing, where most companies, Apple included, decided that if they really wanted to compete, they had to build all the stuff themselves. But as you write in your book, that line of thinking really ended up reaching its limits in the mid to late 1990s. So why don't you start our narrative there and tell us that story?
Yeah, I talked to the earliest employees at Apple, and it was just part of the ethos that you built your own computers, right? This is how Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met, at the Homebrew Computer Club, right? They'd be taking apart computers, presenting to other people. And Steve Wozniak's genius was to take apart a computer, improve some of the circuitry himself, and then re-put it together in a faster way. So Apple wasn't doing anything different by assembling computers themselves. That's what you had to do. I mean, I don't really think the electronics manufacturing supply chain really existed, certainly not in a globalized sense of taking things from Taiwan and everything. That's all later. And so the computer that I really give credit for making that was the IBM PC in 1981. The computer that Steve Jobs largely misunderstood, because when he disassembles it, he basically looks inside and says, there's nothing special here. He's not wrong about that, but what he misses is that IBM had launched a whole new battleground that Apple wasn't really prepared to fight against. So the IBM PC is not about the graphical user interface. It's not about user design or UX. It's about making these things and building them at massive scale. And to do that, they rely on these third-party assembly giants, one of whom I really highlight called SCI, Spacecraft Incorporated, which you could think of as like the Foxconn of its day. It's founded out of Alabama, plays a role in satellites and rockets, plays a role in the Saturn V rocket that goes to the moon. And then once they have that military precision, IBM scouts them out and they end up doing the circuit board for the first PC and then assembling computers writ large. And then they play this massive role basically doing that for HP and Dell and all these other companies, along with a rise of a whole new industry of Selectron, Celestica, Jabil, all these American companies who outsource on behalf of the PC giants. And they give birth to electronics globalization, because once you have standardized parts in this booming industry, then the likes of Taiwan can outmaneuver everybody else and start building them in great quality and at great scale. And by doing that, they then vertically integrate. They go back or upstream and do more of the computer until by the mid-90s, you have Taiwanese companies that are just putting together everything and badging it with different names. And then they're even badging it with their own names. So there is this sort of fascinating 20-year history where Steve Jobs in particular has this DNA that he leaves to the company, which is that we will build it ourselves because we're going to design it ourselves. And that's how we distinguish ourselves, even as the PC companies go to this outsourcing boom. So when he goes to Next Computer, the other company he founds after he's ousted from Apple in 1995, he says of the computer, my favorite thing about it is that it wasn't built in Osaka. Obviously, Japan was playing the role that China plays now. And there's something really fascinating about that. And even when the narrative after 1997, when he comes back, really is that Apple has to outsource, it takes Tim Cook years to convince Steve Jobs to really give up manufacturing. And I write about how in 2000, he handed out T-shirts to everybody that said Mactories on them. And he wanted these Mac factories to really play a role. And I think without the dot-com crisis, you really would have had Apple really trying to make a push in building things themselves, which would have included building in America. But Apple stock, as people sometimes forget, loses 50% in a single day in September 2000. And they're almost purchased. Well, maybe I shouldn't say they're almost purchased, but Gateway thinks they're such a contender that they could purchase them. That's how bad things are at Apple, that Gateway, of all companies, is going to acquire them. Anyway, I guess my point is I just have this like manufacturing-focused history of Apple that is a new angle to report on the company, and yet I think it shouldn't be a new angle. This is a company that manufactures. Now they orchestrate the manufacturing, but their DNA was doing it all themselves. And this shouldn't be some like obscure angle to have brought a new lens to, but somehow it is. And so I'm uncovering more than I should have been able to, because I think we should have been reporting on this the last 25 years, really.
You know, it's fascinating, Patrick, because like when people think of Apple's moat and what distinguishes them from the competition, a lot of folks first go to iOS, right? All right, Patrick, so we have this America arc, and then we have this go abroad to lots of different countries and try to find one that, or try to find a basket of countries that works for them. What were some of the starts and stops in that arc in the 90s and early 2000s before they ended up going to China?
So this will sound less strange if the listener understands that Apple had a tricontinent strategy for building sort of local, but at the continental level, if you will. So Apple built its own computers in California and Colorado. That's obviously for North America. For Europe, they built them out of Ireland. And for Asia, they built them out of Singapore. So when they really get involved with contractors in the late 1990s, they have them replicate this strategy. So LG makes the translucent computer, the Bondi blue color that then becomes Lifesaver color. And LG does it in Korea, but when they expand to meet demand, they do so in Wales and in Mexico. When Foxconn comes on as a second supplier, this is really the meeting of the minds of Foxconn founder Terry Guo and Tim Cook, who's a pretty new person at the time, but is running operations. Foxconn does it in China, which is significant because Foxconn's Taiwanese and some of the other Taiwanese companies are not in China at that point. I'm thinking of Inventec, for instance, which does the iPod in 2001, and that's out of Taiwan. But then Foxconn expands, and they expand to the Czech Republic for Europe and Fullerton, California for America. And it's once you are comparing costs and efficiency between these three regions that China is just winning out time and time again for multiple years, such that by 2003, Apple is effectively given up everywhere else and really consolidated into China. I suppose technically the Czech operations are in effect until 2010 or so, but everything is moving to China because China is just like tailor-making policies for someone like Apple. Industrial clusters are forming. They are putting up factories, not in great quality, but at an amazing scale. I have this funny anecdote with this engineer from Apple in the early 2000s in Shenzhen is literally counting the stairs between floors because it's so obvious to him that it's not the same distance, not the same length between each floor. And he's even measuring the stairs, and he's just finding this is so slapdash. Everything's put together so quickly, which does, if we're jumping ahead, have implications for us because, of course, we would never build something that quickly because we would emphasize the quality, the safety, and everything else, like things that we should emphasize. And yet, by having that, we would still be doing the environmental paperwork by the time an entire factory in Shenzhen would be built. John Rubinstein's anecdote for the iPod is that it's basically steel girders when he goes there and sees the iPod factory actually up and running because when you get to the second floor and it's all finished, but the rest of the building is not, and yet they're still churning out iPods. So there's this amazing sense that when Apple really goes to China in the early 2000s, it is very early days. China is not known for quality at the time. They are known as a manufacturer, of course, but they're not building quality electronics, and that's something that Apple plays a pretty instrumental role in.
So one of the reasons why I found this book so fascinating was because it was like the story of global electronics manufacturing in a book, in a company, in a country, across a number of different countries. And you chart the movement of Apple's efforts to figure out the best place to manufacture, the one place that the country that might suit their quality needs, their extremely demanding, rapidly changing specifications. And the way I think of it is they kind of like are dating a bunch of countries over time. And you know that they're going to marry Apple. They're going to marry China in the end, right? They're going to marry Foxconn, and that it's like a rom-com, Harry meets Sally, and you're going to follow like the dating along the way. But I just wonder if you could tell that story of searching for the right partner. And in the background, I have in my head the whole flying geese model of development in East Asia, where this was conceived of by a Japanese theorist in the 1930s about how Japan would take the lead technologically, and then over time, different sectors would move on to, say, South Korea, Taiwan, and then eventually to maybe China. And the Apple story, the Apple manufacturing story, matches that so well in terms of the search. And by the time you go through the process, you're like, okay, come on, I know you're going to end up in China. Why not get there? But what were some of the steps along the way? And what were the highlights and low points too? And why did they end up settling on China as the place to be?
So a saying I love about journalism is that you should always show, never tell. And when I was submitting the book, or when I submitted the manuscript, my biggest black swan worry was that my editor would say, I don't understand why this book begins in 1996. China's not in the book for the first 95 pages. Let's just get there. But the whole point was I needed to tell you without actually ever explicitly saying so, that Apple had this totally obsessive, maniacal perfection, no tolerance for defects attitude. And you needed to understand that when they were building something like the iMac G4, the thing that people might remember because it's anthropomorphic, it looks a little bit like a Pixar lamp. I joke that it looks like it's ready to break dance. And indeed, that's actually the first commercial that Apple used for it, sort of grooving to the beat, nodding its head. Nobody knew how to build that thing. And Apple sort of upended tool and machine makers all across Taiwan to get it done. And again, without me explicitly saying so, the reader begins to understand Taiwan's just too small to get this done. They're literally having to get people from the Philippines just to fill the factory lines. And they're using like a VCR machine maker in Malaysia. They're relying on Singapore Airlines for the blade fabrication facility. And you just realize that for them to have a meeting about various supply chain conundrums that they're having, you're having to get on flights and hand carry things from one country to the next, which, by the way, is illegal. And they're doing so with 5 or 6 countries as far apart as Singapore and Japan. And so when China begins to basically offer all of this in one industrial cluster around Shenzhen, it is just like mind-bogglingly good for anyone involved. And one thing that I say in interviews, I don't think I explicitly say so in the book, is that Tim Cook is often credited as the architect of the China strategy. He's really not the architect, and there is no architect. It's just that suppliers themselves, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of them, are all choosing China. Because if they're comparing Singapore versus China, the labor rates, the abundance of labor, the flexibility of that labor, the sort of hard-working determinedness of that labor is all off the charts in China versus any other place. And so the suppliers themselves are all moving there, and Apple is just able to take advantage of that movement more than anybody else. So if you still want to give Tim Cook a title, I would say he was more like an admiral navigating the macroeconomic seas of supply chains, but he's not really the architect because he didn't have to strategize anything. Terry Guo was strategizing. Tim Cook was following, but then doing more with what Terry Guo and others were coming up with than anybody else.
Yeah, you have this line, nobody architected a move to China, but in one opportunity after another, Apple operations were lured into the country. You saying, oh, let's have a tri-continental strategy just sounds ridiculous sitting here in 2025, but it's also the case that you were just scaling hardware manufacturings at an exponential rate for 20 years. So if you're making 10,000, 50,000, it's not so insane. But I think, as you write about in your book, the number of actual items you're making is increasing you're multiplying by 10 or by 50 or even by 100 on a year-on-year basis. And it is getting more difficult and complex. And the labor required is also rising at an exponential curve. And I'm sorry, you're just not going to find that many people in Wales and Singapore to do all this stuff.
I would actually emphasize another thing, which is that Moore's law is decreasing the size of the products. So Apple is not a big volume player in anything until 2003, right? I think 2003, they make more iPods in a year than they made iMacs in the prior 5 years. And so if you're shipping things either by air or by sea, the fact that it's the size of an iPod rather than a desktop computer is a major, major distinction. So when SEI was building stuff in Huntsville, Alabama, it wouldn't have made sense for them to move over to China and be really early on this trend. That would make no sense at all. The computers were just too big and bulky, and especially if you went back 10 years where it was like a mainframe computer the size of a garage. Once you're into laptops, which is really where Taiwan first makes its mark, it begins to make a lot of sense, and especially when you get into iPods and then dumb phones and especially smartphones, which then scale, that just becomes a dramatic increase in efficiency, and the cost per item, the logistics basically becomes de minimis once you're doing it in the millions, let alone the tens and hundreds of millions.
Yeah, speaking of the logistics, I just love the parts about United Airlines and the Boeing 747 playing a role in both directions. So you're talking about the product getting smaller and smaller to the point where you can have like a Boeing full of iPhones that's totally worth a flight, more than worth a flight. And so they're helping to export this product around the world. At the same time, they're providing the inputs in terms of the Apple engineers and the managers flying in. It's ridiculous. Entire flights, I think you had documented, were basically for Apple staff to go back and forth between Cupertino and Chengdu or Shenzhen or other parts of China. It was astounding.
Yeah, you're finding this poetic symmetry that I didn't actually make myself. Well done, Kyle. Yeah, but just to give that anecdote, 'cause that's pretty funny. I forget which cities it was in what order, but in 2014, it's probably Chengdu, and in 2016, it's probably Hangzhou, where the same thing happens, where Apple convinces United Airlines, look, we need you flying one way, nonstop to this place 3 times a week, and it doesn't matter if the rest of the plane is empty. We will pre-purchase so many of the first class tickets that you will still make money. I just think that's hilarious. People that went to Shanghai and then took the bullet train to Hangzhou beforehand said it wasn't exactly a schlep. It was pretty easy, but if you were an American engineer who had to go there regularly and you didn't want to have to deal with the Chinese signs and all this kind of stuff, it was just like a nice comfort or whatever. And because Apple just had so many people going, it was worth them doing so. That was just amazing. And then the thing that was already out, but maybe people don't know it, is in 2019, United accidentally leaked that 50 engineers from Apple were flying first class from San Francisco every day, and they were the largest corporate client on the planet. So yeah, when you talk about Apple's size, there are so many things you can point to that says like they really upend like entire industries. Who knew that the airline industry was one of them?
Yeah, Kyle, there's also a paper here for you about like this like reverse gravity trade thesis where like the smaller the item is, like the more you can globalize or something. There's like, or maybe it's like the weight is your coefficient. I don't know. This is why I didn't get a PhD. I want to talk about the design of the items themselves and how that ended up like predicating this entire model of Apple bringing its engineers as well as needing more labor. Like you have this refrain over and over again where people say, like the contractors who don't see the future say like, what are you, crazy? We can't do this. And then Apple comes up with a new manufacturing methodology, which is both labor intensive and requires a level of sophistication that they basically have to teach to their contract manufacturers in order to execute. So let's do a case study. Pick your favorite item. Which one haven't you talked about on the other podcast?
I don't think I've done a case study for any of the podcasts. I mean, the translucent iMac is the one where the chapter is called Unmanufacturable. And that's where I think I probably devote so much attention. It's also a computer everybody knows. There's like, one thing I hadn't banked on was that people say there's a sense of nostalgia when they're reading the early chapters because they're going through some of the products that they loved as like a high school or university student.
Totally. I felt the same way. I mean, it was very tangible in a way. Like I remember being 12 years old, going to my uncle's house, seeing his candy colored iMac and being like, what the hell? Like, it's just this object from space. And no, it's not from space. It's from these like crazy engineers who are like battling with Steve Jobs and the, manufacturing people. So thank you for that. I don't know. Our younger listeners out there, like Google these things. They are beautiful. They're in like design museums now and your older cousin's closets if they were smart enough to keep them. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. Patrick, continue.
So the computer was considered unmanufacturable by the product designers, the product design team at Apple, the tooling engineers at Apple, who just looked at what Johnny Ive had come up with and said, like, this can't be built. I'm not saying it can't be built in scale. We can't build one of these in the lab. And it's really interesting because they have basically created this thing that's impossible. And yet this is where, in a sense, you get the Apple mentality of, even though it's impossible, we're going to figure it out. And in the end, they don't figure it out, and the design has to be changed. But nevertheless, in hindsight 2020, it looks like Johnny Ive had tasked them with something that was impossible just for the sake of seeing who would stay on the project to get it done. So I'm not saying that was actually intentional. Johnny Ive had to go back to the drawing board. They had to make major changes to the product. But nevertheless, by the time they have a product that can be built, the only people left on the team are those who were so willing to try and experiment all these new things. So if people remember the computer, it sort of has these like translucent pinstripes on the front. And those used to be horizontal. And what the engineers would tell me is that they couldn't be horizontal because of, if you know how plastic injection molding works, the mold sort of has to be parallel with the lines. And so Johnny Ive had done something where they were perpendicular to the lines. And so that just couldn't work. And they experimented for months. I mean, they had specialists come in from the outside to work on the product. And what's kind of fascinating is Steve Jobs has just come back, right? This is the product that basically, in my telling, because I've got all these Steve Jobs notes from the summer of 1997, this is an interesting period where he's given the role of CEO if he wants it, but he won't take it. And I think what his notes reveal is that he thinks Apple's about to die and he doesn't want to oversee its demise. So he's trying to help and see if it's possible. And it's a meeting of the minds with Johnny Ive. He goes to the meeting expecting to fire him. Johnny Ive goes to the meeting with his resignation letter in his pocket. And instead, they really hit it off. And what they come up with is the translucent iMac. And if you've seen the eMate 300, this sort of translucent product that they'd already made, but it was sort of like a Newton, sort of like a Newton and a laptop mixed together, that was the first translucent product they made. And so you can see how Steve Jobs would have got excited by that and began to envision what he thought at the time was a network computer. That was their big idea. So sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. So they come up with this design. Steve Jobs gets all excited about the idea of Apple making a comeback and redefining the aesthetics of the computer. But the first thing that Johnny Ive comes up with, like, literally can't be made. And the product design team goes through multiple iterations of who the leader is, because nobody can do this. But Steve Jobs has inherited this team. He honestly doesn't know if they're any good. And so when they basically tell him it's unmanufacturable, and he goes on this tirade where he says he threatens to sell his one last fucking remaining share of Apple stock and so forth, he goes to his favorite design consultancy called Acorn, these two guys who had actually designed the next computer, that black magnesium cube, if you're familiar with it. And they basically go through all the blueprints and they agree with Apple's team, like, this cannot be built. This is not a quality design. And I found this really interesting because when I've read biographies of Johnny Ive, in grade 7, 12-year-old Johnny is all about minimalist designs and elegant sketchings, and you just don't get the sense of, like, how did this guy actually develop? And for me, this was a real turning point where Johnny Ive realized I need to know more about manufacturing to actually be able to give something that can truly be built, because he does have to change the lines. They do have to actually make the computer foggier than they wanted it to be because the inside was actually kind of ugly. The circuit boards were sticking out and things like that. That's something that they eventually changed by 1999 or 2000. But yeah, he'd sort of idealized this computer that couldn't be built. But the changes that they make, I quote somebody else saying, like, they're not major changes. Like, the essence of the idea still lived. It was still this egg-shaped thing rather than this, like, angular square. But it is the product that absolutely saves Apple. And if they couldn't, on the fly, figure out how to build it and how to change the design so that it was manufactured, right? The term is DFA, designed for manufacturing. Apple really wouldn't exist. It was absolutely that clear. The company was going to be bankrupt if this product wasn't a hit and it becomes America's best-selling computer. So it's quite a dramatic narrative.
Kyle, I want to tie this to Rendon Fei a little bit. So, we're running this episode after our Ava Doe Huawei Way series. And this story, I think, is another one of these, like, leadership matters anecdotes. Kyle, is there a Ren Zhengfei angle here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it. So Ren Zhengfei of Huawei is famous for pushing his team to the limit and then some. There's all sorts of issues related to the work culture, people being driven too hard, but then that culture being carried with those personnel later on when they leave Huawei and go out to other parts of the Chinese ecosystem. And so I see this sort of parallel with a maniacal focus on realizing this concept, whatever it is, whether it's going to be a cutting-edge Ascend AI chip, or whether it's going to be this candy-colored, perfect device that everyone wants to buy, everyone sees in the store and wants to buy immediately. That kind of drive is just very reminiscent. Also, Terry Goh plays a huge role in this story, and I see a similar parallel with his personality, although complementary in some ways, like the way that he's so cheap, for lack of a better term, right? Trying to show his focus on efficiency that, he eschews sort of like the glitzy corporate HQ of Apple. But they share ultimately the same goal of producing at scale with ruthless efficiency these goods that will make all of them together a lot of money.
I've got to throw in the DAP here, the Divorce Avoidance Program, because so many marriages are broken up in the first 5 years of Steve Jobs' comeback that the engineers basically are given these different policies to save their marriages. And so one of them is just an understanding that Jordan and Kyle aren't going to be to work today because their marriages are on the line. So please give them a break. And that works well for a time, except that we really need Jordan and Kyle on the factory line. So instead, it's if we need to send them to Korea on like a random Sunday just after they got back 2 days earlier and their spouse is going to be upset, let's just give her $10,000 because we need to assuage her somehow. We don't want to be losing engineers through attrition. But that was happening to such a degree that all these policies needed to come out about. And it's really funny. I mean, I say it's funny. It's tragic as well. I'm getting the stories 20 years after the fact, right? But people will talk about like the dollars were called Danny Bucks or Dan Bucks in reference to VP of Product Design Dan Riccio, because I guess he was the person who fought for these things. But yeah, sometimes our narrative is maybe overly emphasizing just how difficult the Foxconn workers worked, and that's necessary. And obviously it gets to the point of suicides and suicide nets to prevent that from happening. But the Apple engineers were doing a similar number of hours, but also having to fly back and forth all the time. And yeah, it was causing so much strain that Apple had to institute these policies that engineers talked about. As soon as if you talk to anyone on the iMac project in the late 1990s and you mention the DAP, they haven't thought about it for 20 years, but they immediately know what you're talking about, and then they start telling stories. And I should say that one guy said, never mind the divorces, you need to look at the deaths. And that sort of shook me out of my stupor. I was finding the DAP a little funny at times, and this person was really saying like there was nothing funny about it, and he could rattle off names of people who had really like died on the production line or just come back and died. And I didn't want to overemphasize that just because as a journalist I can't determine, especially when someone died 15 years ago or 20 years ago, that overwork was the cause of death. And yet Steve Jobs himself says that the reason he thinks he got cancer is that he was working so hard as CEO of both Pixar and Apple in 1997 that his immune system was weak and it sort of allowed cancer to creep into his system. Whether that's the medical diagnosis, I don't know, but Steve Jobs understood that himself or believed that about himself.
And I think another interesting parallel is the exit opportunities for these people existed. And the compensation that they were getting was not so incredibly different than what they could find at other firms from the Apple side that they couldn't find other jobs. But there was something to this work that similar to early Huawei, which was, it's not just the money. There is an aspect of like team and mission and excitement that was around in this era of Apple, which drove the Apple employees to sort of give themselves and give all they had and more to this company and these products.
Jordan, let me agree on one part. I do think there's a band of brothers bunker mentality that would happen among the Apple engineers putting in the 18-hour days. On the other hand, Apple later gets sued for collusion because there was an agreement among Silicon Valley giants not to hire from each other's firms. And one of the engineers I spoke with is someone that sued Apple later on because he didn't understand at the time how being such a high-profile product design engineer at Apple wasn't getting job offers. Like he was like, I'm doing such a good work. Why aren't I being hired by Motorola or Google or whoever? And so much later, he found out that was basically taboo. And Steve Jobs had really yelled at people and the emails came out later. And I forget exactly what happened. I'm pretty sure they settled. The evidence was pretty good that there was collusion among the tech giants.
I just got to read this short snippet. Apple dumbfounded the industry when it purchased more than 10,000 CNC machines in a single year, enabling a form of mass production that Steve Jobs called a whole new way of building notebooks. Apple even made a deal with Fanuc, an automation group from Japan, to purchase its entire pipeline of CNC machines for years to come, shutting out all of its competitors from access, and then scour the globe for more. Quote, there were not enough CNC machines in the world to do the machining that we need to do, one person said. I was just so struck by the scale. It also, again, this right to also like, biographies of like Elon Musk. We need this part now. Whatever it takes, fly it out personally, make it happen. Or for this Apple story, for the aluminum single body MacBooks, this is just what it's going to be. If it takes 10,000 CNC machines, then so be it. We'll fly them over, whatever. So those stories is just really captures the whatever it takes mentality.
Yeah, so just so the listener knows, we've jumped ahead to 2008 here. But yeah, this was an achievement of imagination. There's nothing novel about a CNC machine. I forget how many decades they go back, but the thing is that they just build prototypes. But Apple had the wherewithal and the imagination to say, well, wait a minute, if these things are so good, why don't we just build all of our products using these things? And so my focus is on the MacBook, the unibody MacBook. But they're used in all sorts of products, including the iPhone, and have been ever since. These are machines that an individual one costs between $500,000 and $1 million. Now, who knows what Apple is paying when they're able to buy them at scale and they have someone like Tony Blevins negotiating for them. This is so successful, but this is the first time that MD, manufacturing design, is really put on the map. In other words, it's the first time Steve Jobs, in a keynote presentation, talks about their manufacturing prowess. And this is probably the time, I don't know this for a fact, that MD becomes MD. Before then, they're just a part of product design, and it's called supply-based engineering. But now they're a part of ops. And it's interesting that MD doesn't have their own senior vice president. I don't know exactly why it's a part of ops. They should be their own thing. But it's possible that Apple just doesn't love the narrative of more people knowing about this division, because they are the ones where, when my book talks about the geopolitical influence that Apple has, it's really because they're flying MD engineers who are brilliant, usually based in California, but over to Asia to train and audit and supervise and equip these manufacturers, these obviously third-party manufacturers, with what becomes billions upon billions of dollars of machinery. And this is where I get into the argument, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, that Apple's influence is like that of a nation-building program.
So, like, as the design process is thinking up these incredible things and being incredibly creative with the CMC, whatever, one of the questions I have is, to what extent at any point they could have optimized for design features which would have given them more geographic flexibility. The degrees of freedom which Johnny Ive and co. were able to operate under is unique in the industry. And as we've talked through with this Apple Unibody story, as we've talked through with the translucent iMac, they were willing and excited to push the physical design features of their products such that the answer at the end of the equation had to be China and Chinese suppliers. But I guess I'm curious if there were other pathways where they could have introduced more or different constraints at the design phase, such that you could have, at the end of the equation, been able manufacture more stuff in different places around the world without losing as much as you would if you are just trying to manufacture the unibody MacBook as it was designed to be constructed in 2008 somewhere else outside of China.
I think that's a great question. So what I would say is, one question that you get now is, why doesn't Apple just automate these processes so that it's not dependent on Zhengzhou, where you've got 400,000 people building an iPhone? And that sounds like a rational thing to do, but what you would be doing is upending how Apple designs its products, which is to say that Johnny Ive and team, and I'm aware that Johnny Ive has left, but we're just talking about the golden era here, they really could operate with a sort of no constraints mentality. In other words, other companies will say from the get-go, this is going to be automated, so we're going to design for automation. I like to ask people what their favorite Dell computer from the early 2000s was. And of course, none of us have a favorite Dell computer from the early 2000s. And so it's not just the money that Apple's making and investing in China that distinguishes them from others. Because again, they're a small player in the early 2000s. It's what they are doing and the fact that nobody knows how to build it. It is not a knock against China to say that Apple taught them a lot. Because if you're thinking of Apple products, whether it's multi-touch glass or the anthropomorphic metal tubing between the base and the computer for the Sunflower iMac, nobody knows how to build that stuff. I'm not saying the Chinese didn't know how. Nobody knew. And the marriage of Apple and China is really skill and scale coming together. The line I use is that Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs made Apple products unique. Terry Guo and Tim Cook made them ubiquitous. And it really is that sort of marriage. Now, if you had a different mentality where you said, okay, let's make these things easier to manufacture, more automation friendly to give us geopolitical safety, let's say, that absolutely could have happened. And you could have, in a sense, more boring products, less design changes year to year, and you would have been able to have a more resilient supply chain that was more based on production in Mexico, let's say. I think in that world, the first iPhone, if it were built at all, absolutely has a plastic screen rather than a glass screen, right? It is only by working with the Chinese factories at their scale and industriousness that Steve Jobs is able to say, literally after he has presented the iPhone, when he famously pronounces the iPhone in January 2007, he is holding a phone that has a plastic screen. It's in the period between him announcing it and it going on sale that Apple upends the entire thing and basically, I don't know if they come up with multi-touch glass. I mean, multi-touch technology already exists, but they work with a Taiwanese supplier called TPK, which basically builds like the invisible circuitry within the glass so that your finger actually causes an effect, right? You'll notice that if you do that on your window, it doesn't do anything. You need to have a bunch of technology in there. And then worked with lens technology to sort of take the Corning glass that everyone's familiar with. The glass is American made, but then it has to be shaped and tempered and cut. And, there's tens of thousands of people working at Shenzhen Lens to do that. And you have people like Steve Zadesky, who's on a whole bunch of iPod and iPhone patents, literally sleeping on the factory floor to get that all done. China offered something that nobody else has offered. I mean, the reason why the epigraph to the book is a Made in China 2025 document from 2015 that says, without manufacturing, there is no country and there is no nation. Find me another country that has that as their sort of motto, their mantra. You just don't get it anywhere. So sometimes I find it amusing that I have a 90-second soundbite or something on X, and someone will say like, oh, this guy's saying like, China couldn't be anything without Apple or something. And it's just like the total opposite. I'm saying Apple is basically screwed without China because nobody will offer the things that they offer. They were a once-in-a-century partner to respond to the demands of Johnny Ive. And if I'm fast-forwarding a little bit, the only thing I would say is that Apple really thought they were wearing the pants in this relationship for the first 2 decades, let's say 2000 to 2020. And it's only afterwards that there's this realization that, wait a minute, we were sort of lured in by the siren call of an emerging superpower who had all their companies willing to do all these things so that they would learn all the technology transfer and basically put America in a position and all other industrialized nations in a position where none of them can compete because everything has gone into China. And so again, if I'm getting at some criticism that I hear, not of the book per se, but of the social media sound bites.
Can we talk about learning and this process of learning and technology transfer? And because it's such a big deal, not just for Apple, but I think Apple exemplifies a lot. All these foreign firms that China, in many cases, very deliberately tried to bring into the country, try to attract. Maybe it's by the central government, maybe it's by local government, maybe it's certain incentives, maybe it's a whole concerted effort. But the point was to bring in these foreign firms, have them manufacture in China, share know-how, train a whole generation of not just workers, but engineers, managers. And the story of Apple in China, I think, captures that so fantastically. Just to give you a contrast, I love the quote when Apple was working with Sony in Japan. I think you had one of an operations exec from Apple saying he was leaving Tokyo and he was like, yeah, I was in Japan about 5 minutes. Apple can teach the Japanese nothing. And this was earlier in the story, and this was a difficult product, but not as difficult maybe as some of the later ones. But that story was not one of so much of technology transfer. Whereas later on, especially for the case of China and the case of Foxconn, right, there's a very deliberate effort to use Apple as a source of upgrading your entire industrial ecosystem, upgrading your suppliers, upgrading your machinery, your equipment, your all of the like tacit knowledge, not just the blueprints and stuff that you can license and patent, and bring that to China. And I like your point too about how some of the stuff was just not anywhere in existence. It was sort of pioneered, like they were all operating at the forefront. But yeah, if you could say more about just this process of learning, and I read a lot and talk a lot about from the Chinese side of like their very active process of trying to get as much, what I call like the learning machine, like try to just get as much as possible from every kind of foreign firm in high-tech industries. But yeah, this process of tech transfer learning.
Yeah, so in the late 1990s, Apple actually struggles to find contract manufacturers for its products because they're not seen as worth the effort. We have to remember that Apple's creating things in pretty small volumes, and they're very demanding. And, the workers at these Chinese factories often do not like working with Apple, right? Because you've got these overbearing engineers who are dictating all these things. Usually they're dictating it through translation, right? Because these are American engineers who don't speak the language. I mean, I have these funny anecdotes that aren't in the book where some engineers just like have a free weekend. So they decide to go to this factory that they've been training up. And they cause such hell that when they're trying to leave the following day, there's a problem with the car, like the wheel. Maybe it's just out of air or something. What I remember is that basically as the car drove, it was causing sparks to fly. And so they're like, oh, well, I guess we'll have to stay here another day kind of thing. And then they get a call from the leader of the factory who just like demands that the taxi driver drive, even with the sparks flying and everything, because God forbid these Apple engineers come back because they're such a pain in the neck. So this is the sort of level of training that Apple is equipping with, the sort of stuff that makes you go mad. And yet, obviously, they're very, very effective. So, yeah, my narrative about Terry Guo is that he really is the first person to understand this is not about making big volumes necessarily, and this is certainly not about making margins, but we're getting tuition-free, on-the-ground training from these overbearing engineers who are willing to teach our cohorts all sorts of stuff. You know, Apple really meets its match in Terry Guo and vice versa. So this on-the-record anecdote from Tony Fadell is that, you know, he and his team would come in to train the engineers they've been working with and find not a face that they recognize because Terry has taken these sort of like graduates, if you will, and put them on, you know, the Dell line or whatever, where they can use their newfound skill sets to actual like money making effect. And he's like, in a sense, without Apple's permission, started a new semester for these other engineers. I don't think the Chinese really get that until 2016. And that is a key reason why you've really had Foxconn being squeezed out the last couple of years, and they're having to go to India because Apple's essentially telling them, if you want to keep your market share, you need to go to India for us. I guess I'm not trying to jump ahead here too much, but the learning is absolutely fundamental to the relationship between Foxconn and Apple, and really to why all the Chinese factories are able to do so much. And if you really want, we can go into the wonky differences between an ODM and an OEM, and why Foxconn does so much better than Quanta or Inventec or anybody else.
Sure, let's tell that story.
So in the late 1990s, none of the Taiwanese really want to be doing assembly. Assembly is sort of how you get the orders, but it's really low margin. It's totally cutthroat. And so the likes of Inventec and Quanta and the predecessors to Pegatron, they're doing something called ODM work. D is for design. And design means more margin, and it also means more investment. So it's an investment that typically pays off. But what it means is that if you're a Western manufacturer of a computer, you're already offloading your manufacturing to a third party in Taiwan. But what this will allow you, if you work with an ODM, is that they'll also do the research and development, and they'll also do the design. So you have less and less to do. And it really gets to the point where the Taiwanese can literally show a catalog of computer designs, and you just choose one, right? So imagine just how much that sort of takes off your balance sheet. It works really well. The problem, of course, is that the Taiwanese begin branding their own computers and sort of competing against you. And so if there's times of scarcity of a certain product, they're going to source it to their own companies rather than to you as the third party. And so Apple never really falls for this trap, in part because they're wanting to do so much design themselves. It's never appealing for someone to say, we'll do the design for you. So Foxconn, it maintains itself as an OEM, really just like a manufacturer, you know, the manufacturing as a service model. And that's like they're condescended to, right? Because it's not sexy, high margin work. And yet, Terry Guo has an understanding of Chinese politics that nobody else seems to have. I mean, Kyle mentioned that, you know, and this is what we get wrong about Chinese communism. It's not just about the relationships with the federal officials, it's the provincial officials, because the cadres in various districts are incentivized for factory growth. And so they will offer tax exemptions and bonded zones and tailor-made policies and all sorts of stuff, getting in the labor from the hinterlands or whatever, so that your investment goes to that district and not some other cadres, right? So it's worth knowing that that is one of the key distinctions between Soviet and Chinese communism. Soviet really is top down. I don't know that you'd call the Chinese capitalism grassroots per se, but I compare it to federalism on steroids. And it's just something that we miss all the time. The reason why being an OEM is important is the labor intensity and the vertical integration that Foxconn introduces. So instead of doing design and R&D, they really are just building. And what makes them so good at building is having many clients and then allocating those resources. And so that allows Terry Guo to expand, like literally in a real estate sense, building dormitories, building entertainment venues, and having these migrants set up shop in Shenzhen, there all the time. And so if you're doing that, you are making the local cadres in Shenzhen look really good. And so he's able to sort of parlay his brilliant investment strategy, his labor intensity into free machinery, free tools, more labor migrants, etc., in a way that nobody else is able to take advantage of. And so Apple doesn't really understand Chinese politics until 2013 when they're made to, but Foxconn is their biggest partner, and Foxconn understands it very, very well. And what's sort of tragic is Foxconn's never really rewarded very much for this. Their margins fall and fall the closer they get with Apple, but the political connections that Foxconn makes is instrumental to Apple's rise.
So I just asked ChatGPT for the market cap for Apple and all of its sort of near-ish competitors. We've got Apple at 3.25 trillion. We have Samsung at 300 billion. Xiaomi's at 175 billion. Huawei, no one really knows, but 100, 200 billion. Oppo and Vivo, rounding errors. We have this big argument, right? That, you know, the central thesis of your book is like, you know, this is a dangerous trade for America, but we did get a $3 trillion company out of it, even though there was all of this industrial upgrading that Apple helped China do. Setting aside the like getting Chinese people out of poverty angle to this, there's got to be something to be said for the fact that America is now the home to one of the largest company that the world has ever seen.
Yeah, I've tried to answer this. If for whatever reason we were living in a simulation and the game ended now, then obviously Apple got more out of this relationship, and it was a great deal for everybody. And we just lived through a golden age of Silicon Valley focusing on software and China doing the hardware. The problem is it's probably not a simulation. The world continues, and we're now at a point where Apple has no plan B. China, for whatever reason, has become more belligerent and wants to be self-sufficient. That is what Made in China 2025 is. It is a grand master plan to sever itself from the West in terms of automation, robotics, electronics, and other things that I don't go into, pharmaceuticals. And it seems pretty crazy to me that the world's most valuable company doesn't really have any sort of plan B. I mean, the Tim Cook doctrine, if you will, this was named in 2010, maybe 2011, was to basically own and control as much as possible and only enter markets where there could be number one or number two. And as Ben Thompson from Trajectory constantly points out, the fact that everything's manufactured in a fairly hostile country is the biggest violation of the Tim Cook strategy that could possibly exist. So it's quite the gamble.
Another parallel that I think a lot of people might be thinking of at the same time that I thought of looking at this relationship is the way that all of these U.S. chip designers depend on TSMC. So I had tweeted earlier, and it's funny, the numbers still hold like a year later. But NVIDIA, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, combined market cap of 15 trillion, give or take some trillions. And yet they basically all rely on TSMC for advanced semiconductors, for AI chips, for a smartphone. So it's just like incredible that there's this amount of value that's created on the American side from these companies, just purely design. All those companies I'm talking about, maybe with the exception of Tesla, I think you've brought that up in the past. They basically kind of outsource all the manufacturing, and for the high-end chips, that goes to TSMC. And the TSMC itself is probably one of the most valuable companies in Asia, but itself is like an order of magnitude less. There's two big questions. One is, how did we get to this point where we were allowing like global risk to be concentrated so much on a single firm or a single country? Same thing with Apple and China. But then on the other side too, and this is what I was thinking about the whole time I was reading your book, is do you lose something from separating design and manufacturing? How much is it really separated? So your stories about that, Apple engineers flying back and forth, deeply embedding themselves with Chinese suppliers, bringing the machinery, doing this, you have this phrase, man on mirror structure that I really love. That was really interesting. And that was actually for Korea, I believe, but similar model later on for China, maybe 10x. How much can the two be separated, and how much can you still be innovating at the cutting edge when, your manufacturers are somewhere else, maybe in a different country altogether, maybe, 6,000 miles away?
I want to take that on, actually. I think maybe to start, it's a bit of a misnomer to NVIDIA is just a design firm. It's like, no, they are flying back and forth to TSMC all the time too. And, the sort of innovation that you need to create not just the chips, but these racks is like incredibly sort of like manufacturing and like hard tech intensive. So no, it's not just them sitting on EDA tools and rejiggering where the circuits go. It's a very similar story that I think can be told from their perspective. Patrick.
I use Andy Grove, the co-founder of Intel, who had a great Business Week, I think Bloomberg Business Week column in 2010, where he was lamenting that everything had left America's shores. And he basically said, we're going to miss out on shop floor innovation. That if you're not in the factory working on the next product, you are going to lose out. And so he was concerned about the short-sightedness of it. And I think that was quite a profound lesson. And I come back to it later in the book to say that any number of companies in the West do completely just outsource, where they don't know how to build stuff. I mean, it is not clear to me that Facebook has any idea how to build the portal. The portal's not a device that's out there anymore. But that, as I understand it, was a product that was just completely outsourced to companies in Asia who knew how to do it. But Apple, of course, is in a different boat. But Apple is someone who does know how to do it. They've got the experiential know-how. It's built on a bunch of proprietary processes. We know about them doing iOS, but they also basically do software/operating systems for machines. We just don't know about that because we're not on the factory lines. But the problem, and I quote an engineer of 16 years, Michael Hillman, on this, is that to actually execute any of those plans, they need China. The line I often use is that an iPhone has roughly 1,000 components in it. And if you're building 1 million iPhones a day, that means you're doing the logistics, manufacturing, and production of 1 billion components a day. There is one country on Earth that's able to execute that. Anybody else will take at least 10 to 15 years to get to that stage. And because China is a growingly belligerent country, they will not let that happen. If you follow high quality engineering on a sort of map in a really quick way, America has total dominance at the end of World War II. They begin to teach the Japanese to build a radar and electronics industry. When they hit supply constraints and the yen rises in value, it's Japanese entrepreneurs that go to their former colonies, Taiwan and South Korea, to do the same thing. And when Taiwan hits its own constraints, you have better relations with mainland China, and the likes of Terry Guo go over to China and build, the Taichung Taiwanese entrepreneurs have an immense role building out manufacturing capacity in China over the last 4 decades. Now, the next natural place to go really would be India. I mean, Vietnam to some degree, but Vietnam doesn't have the size. India is the next logical place if you just play this game, but no one knows that better than Beijing. And so they want technology transfer to be a one-way gate. The information comes in, and it certainly doesn't go to Karnataka. And so that's where Apple has this big predicament right now, because it makes all the sense in the world to go set up production lines in India. But the machinery is now produced in India, and Beijing just blocks it. And the experiential know-how is in the minds of these Chinese engineers, from the low skill to the PhDs, and they can't get visas to India. So that's why Apple is captured. I'm not using that as a line to sell books. I really don't know what strategic decision Apple can make here that would untie the knot with China. And I don't think that's really plausible. The more plausible thing is that they retie another knot and end up with a bifurcated supply chain. But that's not in China's interest. And if it's not in China's interest, then good luck to Cupertino, because I don't know how they're going to execute that.
Yeah, this is a really big topic actually in like the scholarly world and development world. And Apple is perhaps one of the best examples, but there's so many other areas where it's like, oh, maybe the auto industry will just end up in China. And it like there's not a flying geese next. Maybe a little bit to Vietnam and Thailand, maybe for transshipment to get around tariffs or something like that. And then India, there's always this question. India is making a big push. India wants to be next. India has been waiting to be next for a long, long time, and has been sort of like waiting in anguish, watching China's rise, being like, that should be us. And at the same time, they're making this big push with manufacturing. They have their own big industrial policy, especially targeting iPhone, consumer electronics manufacturing. And to some extent, there seems to be on paper some success. Off-quoted, 20% of iPhones are now assembled in India. But there's big questions about how much of the real supply chain can be brought into country in the way that China had done, whether that's bringing in the foreign firms to invest in manufacturing there or to cultivate your own domestic local suppliers. It's a big question, and that's why I like this. That's another reason why I like this book. It hits on these big topics right now that I think people are asking in a whole bunch of industries.
The case study that I'm looking forward to see play out over the next few years is, wearables. And Meta basically made all of the Oculus in China. And a few months ago, they said, we're going to try to get Goertek, which is its Chinese contract manufacturer, to do like half of it in Vietnam. I mean, good luck, guys. Google's now getting into the game. They had a big announcement a few months ago. They did a big talent acquisition of HTC, which was a Taiwanese-based VR company and are obviously trying to sort of like price all this in and diversify. But you have 6 or 7 Chinese manufacturers who are almost like ahead of the game. Like we did an article on this, Google China Talk AR glasses. I would say like ahead of the game in terms of what is currently on the market in the West when you just look at Meta Ray-Bans as the main thing that people have been exposed to. So there's that dynamic. And I also think another, aside from like the can we make redundancies around the world, like what the frontier of the technology is something that it's clear that just doubling down on China will like get you there faster than trying to be cute in different countries in the world. I mean, the Apple Vision Pro, not a huge commercial success, but like an incredible technical accomplishment and something that, give me a break if you can try to make that at scale or with anywhere near the level of sort of polish and precision that the Chinese contract manufacturers were able to deliver.
Yeah, it's worth knowing that's Luxshare, not Foxconn. So that's the rise of the red supply chain in action. The other one I would point out, by the way, to round out your examples, is Sam Altman and Johnny Ive, right? They're coming up with the next device. Where is that going to be built? Because if you're Johnny Ive, you might demand the best. And the easy thing would be to say, well, of course, we're going to work with the Chinese partners that he knows from 3 decades at Apple. On the other hand, he must be more sort of awake to the issues I point to in the book than anybody. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but I sort of assume as much. And so he might very well know the sort of political agenda of Trump and all the ways that could be used in his favor to sort of build out a nascent supply chain here. It is, of course, much easier to do so if you're beginning to build units literally in the tens, right? Because you're doing prototypes and stuff, than in the 250,000 or 250,000,000, I should say. Apple's scale is so big that sometimes you get it off by an order of magnitude.
Well, on this topic, like the phrase that I kept thinking about was training your replacement. Apple is kind of different, actually. So there's this pattern that we notice again and again where China tries to bring in some foreign firms, or they're attracted by China's very efficient, nimble manufacturing base. They set up shop, and then before you know it, okay, maybe sometimes it takes decades, but in some period of time, you end up with a whole crop of Chinese competitors that are first sort of nibbling away at your market share within China, perhaps, but then starting to expand and then maybe going global. And so you see this again and again. You see this right now happening with the EV industry and Tesla. And there is a whole, debate about like how much did Tesla really sort of turbocharge China's EV industry, or how much of it was already there and Tesla played sort of like a catfish type role. And one thing that was interesting reading your book was Apple had some of this problem. So obviously Samsung is like the most famous long-term global competitor, but also with Huawei, and then a whole fleet, Xiaomi, Vivo, Oppo of Chinese smartphone competitors. You talk about how Apple was able to kept trying to innovate on both the design and manufacturing, both of those in a way that would stay a step ahead of the competition. At least that was the reasoning up until recently. And they were able to kind of like still maintain, along with their brand, they were able to maintain that position in the global market, even within China, even with all the pressures of domestic competitors within China and the high-end part of the smartphone market. So I was just wondering if you could talk about this problem, how Apple dealt with it, this like whole feeling of like, okay, maybe today you are dealing with factories that are springing up from fields with an army of workers who are like literate but are otherwise not very high skilled, versus later on, how does that turn into potentially the very competitors that you find almost existential in other industries, at least?
Well, this is sort of a great segue into one of my favorite chapters, chapter 36, called 5-Alarm Fire, because this is what happens, where Apple realizes the competitors in China have really caught up with them. And so what's amazing about the chapter is that it's exclusively based on a bunch of court documents that were made public, but were never found by another journalist. So I found them 16 months ago, but I'm the only person who's written about them. Even since I published it, nobody's gone to do their own deep dive. But, it's more than 1,000 pages. We're talking about depositions of Tim Cook and others, internal emails between Tim Cook and the board of directors at Apple, between him and the production staff, his underlings, and so forth. And the entire issue is about how the iPhone XR, spelt XR, but pronounced 10R, is basically a dud. And they know that it's a dud. It's basically geared towards the Chinese market, and yet the Chinese are all deciding to buy a competitor from Huawei. And Apple knows this for several weeks, and then tells investors that everything is fine. The chapter is called Five Alarm Fire because that's what a VP of sales or finance described the situation like. It's fireman jargon for at least 100 people are needed on the scene. And the quote from Tim Cook, at least a week before he talks to investors, is, "This is a disaster. We need all hands on deck now." And there are all sorts of people within Apple who are basically panicking about this. And what really happened is that the 10th anniversary iPhone is the first one that has that like infinity pool design, right? You get rid of the thumbprint and you have Face ID. That doesn't ship until November 2017 it must be. And then by April 2018, so just 4 or 5 months later, all 4 of the major Chinese brands have an infinity pool like rival. And so Cupertino is expecting to sort of bask in the glow of this amazing device, and literally everybody catches up. And what you realize is that the Chinese went from mimicry to maybe they're still in the stage of mimicry there, but they're surprising Apple with how quickly they're able to keep up. And then I think now, to fast forward, they are in a stage where they're doing all kinds of stuff that Apple isn't doing. So the example I always point to is the Mate XT from Huawei, which unfolds twice. But there's also silicon carbide batteries in the latest Vivo phones, I think. It might be Oppo phones. But, they have a better density, faster recharge time, faster duration is what I should say, longer duration. Apple is just no longer the company to really pay attention to if you're looking for the most ooh and ah cutting edge phone. And there's something maybe a little bit disquieting about that, especially because not only are the Chinese manufacturing them, but they're obviously doing the industrial design, the product design. I mean, they've really taken that pyramid structure I described in the book, put it organically in their own companies, and are now outmaneuvering Apple on multiple levels of the pyramid.
Yeah. And now we're seeing, especially with all these AI features coming out, Huawei is doing a lot with its Harmony operating system and trying to have AI everywhere where you want it and maybe many places where you don't. Like summaries where you don't really want summaries, maybe a little bit mimicking what maybe iPhone users are getting used to now with some Apple Intelligence. But there's this big question mark whether Apple will be able to catch up and be on the cutting edge in that space. And then, there's the recent sort of issues with linking up with Alibaba, for example, for an AI partner in China, and whether if you don't have that kind of partnership, whether as Apple you can still be competitive in the Chinese domestic market at least.
I'm glad you brought this up because this is mostly post-manuscript for me, right? So it's really not in the book, and yet it's so current and dynamic as a discussion because first of all, Apple has really done poorly with Siri. Siri might have been amazing 14 years ago, but it has not kept up. It's not really even a large language model. So, it's not doing the most basic stuff. And because of Siri's failure, Apple has to be working with a partner. And because ChatGPT or anyone else, Perplexity, is not really available in China, they have to work with a Chinese partner. So that, in a sense, is the closest thing we were going to see on the product side to Apple having a joint venture. And maybe it's not technically a joint venture, but one thing is that my book is about how Apple really consolidated all hardware engineering that it knew into China over the last 25 years. And are you really telling me that now, over the next 25 years, they're going to work hand in glove with Baidu or Alibaba and essentially do the same thing with AI, which is already the stuff of movies for existential risk of humanity and stuff? We're already talking about the most complex, consequential thing in tech, if not just in business or anything writ large. This is up there with fire and the computer, right? So it's I don't know how much sense it makes for Apple to be training one of these companies to make their product better, which inevitably, of course, they would have to do. They're not just going to use an off-the-shelf AI tool, but that's the position they're in because ChatGPT and others aren't available. We really are at the stage where you will buy your next phone based on the AI features it has, and Apple is very much failing there. We are recording this during WWDC, so who knows? Maybe we're way wrong by the time that it comes out, but I feel like that's not going to be the case. They're really behind in AI in a sort of embarrassing way.
The $55 billion annual investment in China, can you deconstruct that number a little bit? Where did it come from and what is it?
Yeah, like what's counted?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Apple's really on the back foot in 2013 when Xi Jinping comes into power. And they're really worried that either their products are going to be blacklisted or they're going to have to form joint ventures to continue operating in the country. And this is total anathema to Cupertino. This is not what they want to happen. And so this team of people that comes into the company, either hired or appointed, they call themselves the Gang of Eight. And they're the first people that are really senior living and working in the country. So this is where you sort of pass the baton from Foxconn to Apple in terms of Apple realizing we can outsource our manufacturing to Foxconn. We cannot outsource our political relationships. And so they take ownership of this. And they do their own supply chain study effectively in tandem with the government affairs team. And what they realize is that they're investing $55 billion, let's not say the country, just to make this clearer, into Chinese factories, into factories that are operating in the country, I should say. And this is, of course, an enormous number, and it's definitely worth asking what it is. Okay, so China has this concept called registered capital. So Apple, in any given year, doesn't make as much money as Walmart. And Walmart, as I understand it, gets 60 to 70% of their products from China. But Walmart's not making investments in the country. If you're importing, I don't know, kitchenware and action toys from China, that does not count as registered capital. That does not count as investment. That is just spend. You are just buying that stuff and putting it on a ship, and it sells in Arkansas or wherever. If you're Volkswagen or GM, you are training workers to run a production line. And so for a certain period, let's say 18 to 24 months, it counts as an investment into the country. It basically counts, like the training costs of setting up a production line count as fixed assets. So they would be counted the same way that putting machinery on the production line is counted. What Apple realizes is that our investment is a lot more like Volkswagen or GM's than it is like Walmart's. We're not just sitting in Pudong ordering parts from Shenzhen Lens. We are going into the factory and we are training them how to do all of this stuff. So our training costs, which are effectively wages, should be counted as fixed assets, should be counted as registered capital. But this is where they sort of go further. Unlike Volkswagen or GM, who sets up a production line and then has it running for 7 years, right? Because the life cycle of a product in the car world is about 7 years. The iPhone never gets to that stage where it just is moving on, right? Like they're always upending the design of every product in the portfolio. And so they're able to count a whole lot of training costs, wages, in addition to billions of machinery that's put on the production line as registered capital. So someone could debate me on this in terms of like, should that be the case should everything that's spend actually be counted as investment? And that's fine if you want to go through accounting rules or whatever. But it's not an argument with me. It's an argument with Apple, and it's an argument with Beijing, which accepted the argument. So that's where the money comes from. That's why it's counted as registered capital, and that's what distinguishes them from other companies because they don't do the training. Other companies are basically just buying off-the-shelf parts, whereas Apple is hand in glove, working in tandem with hundreds of factories, and that's why they're able to basically operate without a joint venture because they're like, you have no idea what influence we are having on hundreds of factories across the country.
I think this is one maybe for Kyle and Patrick. The contract manufacturers that Apple kind of like shepherded, do you have a sense of how their relationship with Chinese handset manufacturers is similar or different?
Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap, and you can break it down. Lens Technology is a supplier to not just other Chinese smartphone manufacturers, smartphone brands, but other ones, Goertek. Some of these suppliers supply across. And then the order of operations, it also depends. But some of them were sort of brought up by Apple and then helped the rest of the Chinese supply chain. Some of them were already serving like lower, for them lower tier customers like Oppo and Vivo before they got their Apple contract. So, I mean, it's sort of a mixed bag. Well, I just want to mention, they had tried to like cozy up to Chen Min-er, who was the party secretary of Guizhou, and so Apple tried to invest in like data centers there, servers, which at a sort of local government politics level is like really great, right? You want to show that you're bringing in investment, generating economic activity, and also especially when it comes to anything high tech, right? So that's like a bunch of gold stars. And that turned out to be a mistaken bet because he didn't end up becoming the successor to Xi. It turned out she was the successor to Xi, and right. And he didn't even end up sort of at the very top echelon of party leadership. I mean, there are other ways where Apple has been like incredibly adept, and especially Tim Cook has been incredibly adept at navigating not just Chinese politics, but also American politics at the same time. So it's not a job I would envy, although I feel like he's probably pretty well compensated.